Okay, so tonight we're continuing through Daniel. And tonight, as you know, it's every week we're in one chapter further. Tonight we're in chapter 7, which is actually a transition point for the book of Daniel. Daniel 7 transitions us from predominantly stories of faith of Daniel and his three friends, if you will, and it transitions us to predominantly visions and dreams. And so here we get into the literature that is often very closely associated with Ezekiel as well as Revelation. And by the way, Revelation, we talked about this several years back when we studied the book of Revelation. To understand Revelation, it helps to read different parts of the Old Testament, but specifically the books of Daniel and Ezekiel, because a lot of the apocalyptic language in there, the figurative language and so forth that's found in Daniel that we're going to get to, we've gotten to some of it already, as well as that found in Ezekiel. A lot of that is very, very similar to Rome and to, not Rome, I'm sorry, but to Revelation. And Revelation actually, to some degree, talks about what the prophecies we see in Daniel coming to fruition, to partially, right? Because there's a historical aspect, but also a yet to come aspect of Revelation. And in Daniel, there's definitely a historical aspect, but there's some areas that seem to point towards both. And we'll get deeper into those. Now, once we get through this transitionary passage, we get even deeper into some of that language. And so if you like history, we've had a great 6 chapters of history with a couple of visions. If you like imagery and these dreams and so forth, we're coming to a whole bunch of that. So hopefully it'll be an enjoyable experience, and hopefully we'll better understand what's being predicted here. Daniel is often used to present things that are not necessarily accurate. And what it is it's cherry picking different things out of Daniel to force fit into different things that, if you will take it in its context and let Daniel kind of explain itself, it makes a whole lot more sense. So again, the first half of the book was concerned with Daniel and his three friends and their stories of faith, their stories of God's triumph, and their stories of being followers of God, what God can accomplish. And by the way, we still see these stories throughout the remainder of Daniel. But here, the friends completely disappear, and we're left learning of visions and dreams that Daniel has, and visions and dreams that Daniel interprets and that God shares with us. Before visions and dreams came to kings and pagans, the focus first shifts to dreams and a vision given to Daniel himself, right? So I said that wrong and read that wrong, but the gist is, earlier, who was having the dreams and visions? It was the kings, right? Now Daniel's going to get some of these. And what's interesting is earlier, I don't know why I have a pen in my hand, it's not like I'm writing. Earlier, Daniel was the one who interpreted the dreams. Here, Daniel now needs the interpretation of the dreams. And I'm going to switch real quick. If you'll bear with me, my earbuds just died on me. Everyone, hold on one moment. Por favor. Okay, we're back. You gotta love technology until it stops working correctly, don't you? And I even charged, or I thought I had charged those things. I may not have had them plugged in whenever I was charging them today. Okay, so now we're back into Daniel chapter 7. Here, Daniel has to have the dreams interpreted to him. The last half of the book contains 4 visions that are given to Daniel, and all of these occur during the time frame of the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So here it seems like we're going backwards, but these are things that took place early on in Daniel in that time frame of the first 6 chapters. The 4 visions, the first is the vision of the 4 beasts in chapter 7. So then in chapter 8, we have the vision of the ram and the goat. Chapter 9, this gets to be a very interesting vision, the vision of the 70 weeks. And that's going to be a really fun study because there's a whole lot of discussion of what on earth it's talking about. And then finally, chapters 10 through 12, we have vision of the time of the end, which that's where we get into, there's some historical significance as well as potentially some future significance as well. But as we go through this, we see so much that is actually going to come to fruition throughout history as we follow even extra biblical historical sources. We see a lot of this come into play. So let's go into Daniel chapter 7. Let's read the first 8 verses here. Verse 1 of Daniel chapter 7 reads, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon." So again, now we've gone backwards to Babylon, right? We were in the Medo-Persian Empire as of last week with Darius, but now we've gone backwards to Belshazzar, and this is around 550 BC, give or take a few years. Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Almost sounds kind of like the sugar plums dancing in their heads, right? For the night before Christmas. But then he wrote down the dream and he told the sum of the matter. So Daniel writes it down and he explains what this is. Daniel declared in verse 2, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off," or clipped, some translations say. "And it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, 'Arise, devour much flesh.'" Verse 6, "After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." In verse 7, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast." Now look what's different with this 4th beast. Look what he starts out with. A 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, and exceedingly strong. Isn't that interesting? He now all of a sudden shifts. And it gives them chills in the night, if you will. "It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up another among them, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things." So, has it been a while since you got to have read that? This is really interesting for a lot of reasons. One of which, whenever I talked about the terrifying beast, my dog started trying to terrorize its little toy over here in the background. But this is really interesting because here we see, similar to the statue, similar to the other visions, here we see a prediction of what's going to take place. But now, rather than this vague idea, remember the statue, it talked about there's going to be all these kingdoms. There's going to be Babylon, then there's going to be the Medo-Persian kingdom, then there's going to be the Grecian kingdom, then there's going to be the Roman kingdom, and then there's going to be this little tiny rock that comes and cut by non-human hands that just destroys the entire thing, right? We see this vague idea about kingdoms that are going to come and go. And now Daniel receives a vision that describes in much greater detail. Now it's still pretty vague, but in much greater detail how some of this and what some of this means and how it will unfold. So Daniel saw this vision in the first year of Belshazzar, which is again back in the Babylonian Empire. And this time frame, as we said, would have been around 550, give or take a little bit, BC. He reveals the vision and he sees these four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. Many scholars, after reading Isaiah 17, verse 12, Revelation 17, verse 15. So this is where, and I mentioned Ezekiel, but Isaiah helps with some of this literature as well. This is where reading all this literature together, kind of one after the other, Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, or Daniel, Ezekiel, Revelation, either of those are good ways to do it. It really kind of gives some clarity if you study through each of those books leading up to Revelation, because it gives you some insight into what's going on, and you get more and more detail through each one. Many scholars believe the sea represents the mass of humanity, and so the four beasts here, they're coming from within the mass of humanity. In other words, they're stirring it up. They're coming from within. They parallel the great image we see in chapter 2 of the great statue, right? The four beasts represent these four empires, but they go much greater into detail. Did you catch that rather than just saying what they're made of, Daniel describes in detail in this vision? It's described in detail what's going on with these. And so the four beasts represent the four worldwide empires of the earth. And again, Babylon. And this is important because, especially when you get into Revelation is actually taking part and the coming to fruition to some of this. It's Babylon, right? That's the greatest, the head made of gold. And then you get the Medo-Persian, then you get the Grecian, then you get the Roman Empire that comes through these. So the lion and head, the lion, which had wings of eagles, represents the Babylonian Empire. What's interesting about that? Do you guys know anything? You've probably seen it, whether or not you connect it to Babylon. What's interesting about the lion with wings on it? Have you guys seen that somewhere before? You guys ever heard, if I get the name right, the Ishtar Gate? I see mouths moving. I can't hear anyone though. Have you guys ever look it up online? Actually, let me see if I can share it with you. I'll describe it while I look it up. So Babylon, this is one of the figures, Ishtar Gate. Oh, this is cool. See, look, we're going to see if technology works for us here, because this is going to be really cool if it does. Okay, well, okay, so we're going to share screen. I'm going to share this right here. We don't need to share audio because, okay. Do you guys see this? So this is on what's called the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate is this right here, which is an ancient gate of Babylon. And within this gate, as you come in, there's a section in which you actually get to see these right here. And well, I'm sorry, I pulled up the bull. I thought I pulled up the other one. Anyway, this is what happens when I do it all really quick and really fast. I noticed that this is a different picture, but go and research it, because we see a whole lot of different images from the Babylonian times. You can't really see them from this angle. That's fine. I'll try to Google it and pull up a picture and remember next week to show you. But the short version is, this is one of the things that is prevalent in Babylon, the lion with the eagle's wings on it. There's reliefs found throughout Babylon, all over Babylon, with this image on there, which I've always found interesting. And many people believe that the two wings that are on it, these two wings represent two of the kings and the co-regency that we've seen with Belshazzar and another guy during that time. But the short version is, here we see God giving Daniel this vision saying, hey, look, remember that vision I gave all that long time ago? Well, here it is again, but I'm going to be a little bit more explicit about what this means. I'm going to show this definitively to be Babylon. and what Babylon represented. Because we see then the next one becoming the bear, which represents the Medo-Persian Empire. This is raised up on one side. Many people believe that this indicates the supremacy of the Persian Empire within the Medo-Persian. The Medes were pretty substantial, but then the Persians kind of just led and made it so much greater. The three ribs may depict three of the major Medo-Persian conquests. That Cyrus, I don't know if you've heard of Cyrus and his son. Well, you've probably not heard of his son because he's not really well known, but Cyrus the Great. You guys ever heard of Cyrus? Basically, there were these big conquests. I have just like short cliff notes because going into a lot of detail on this, I mean, it gets me confused because there's so many different viewpoints on this. And a lot of it's just assumption, but what we know is a lot of this imagery is found within each and every one of these empires heavily. And so we know that they represent empires, and we know that to some degree, some of the details of these represent things. So the wings, I think that's fair to say the wings suggest the co-regency, which solidifies this. The bear, I think that's great. I don't know that it talks about the three conquests, but that's a really good, important thing. But then we get into the two that I find most interesting. That is the leopard and the fourth beast, because these are two. The leopard takes place in the Grecian Empire, which I really have a very huge interest in the Grecian Empire as it is. This is the third beast, and the leopard is said to be indicating the swiftness at which Greece will take over the world. Greece will take over. Alexander the Great, if you guys remember that name, right? Famous name. We all studied him in school at some point. Alexander the Great conquered the world faster at that point than anyone else had ever done. He did things that were believed to be impossible. He was a great, powerful conqueror. And so this leopard comes into play, and it has that speed, if you will, of Alexander the Great. And then there's four heads. The four heads symbolize, many believe, the four major territories of Alexander's kingdom, or the four Hellenistic monarchs. I think it's the territories personally. And again, all this stuff I'm giving you in case you want a little bit more. You can go look in good commentaries, and they list a bunch of this stuff. But I want to get to these next couple of things. The fourth beast, the horrifying beast. What's the fourth empire after Greece? Rome. It's terrifying. It's strong. It's this beast that commands attention, if you will. And Daniel is just, he's got chills going up his spine, it seems like, whenever he notices this beast. The difference in this beast and the previous is that it also has 10 horns on it and has claws of bronze. The horns likely indicate power and probably refer to the first 10 emperors of Rome. And we see Rome is this powerful force to be reckoned with. The world was in fear of Rome. And all throughout this story, whether or not what we think and what it represents and which specifics it represents, the point that we're seeing here is God is foretelling something, and God knows the future. God knows the future. And by the way, from the horns come up a little horn that replaces or plucks up three, I believe, if I remember the reading correctly. Many believe this is to be Domitian, because Domitian was a horrible, 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 horrible ruler. And then we see then a judgment scene up here within this time frame. So we're going to read about that in a moment. But again, I'm trying to, especially in these stories and these visions, I want to pluck out, okay, what can we learn from this? I think the biggest one I want to focus on for the first 8 verses tonight rather than get bogged down in details, because the details get real interesting, is God knows the future. We've seen this all throughout Daniel, haven't we? God knows our future, which to me, and hopefully to you, that's very comforting. God knows the future. God knows what the future holds. The good news for Daniel, the good news for his friends, the good news for the Jewish people is God knows the future, and the future is bright for the people of God, right? Now, keep in mind as we read through some of this, there's going to be persecution. There's going to be horrible things done to the people of God. But ultimately, we win. That's the story of Revelation, isn't it? God wins, which means we win. God knows the future. That means if we're suffering, God knows that we were going to suffer. And if God knew we were going to suffer and God allows us to suffer, there's probably a reason why we're being allowed to suffer, right? And by the way, that doesn't mean God orchestrates the suffering, but sometimes he just allows it to happen. God didn't create the suffering of Job, did he? But he allowed the suffering, and he knew the suffering. We have great insight that we don't know if Job ever got. Because all we know at the end of the book of Job is, what does God say? Who are you to ask all these questions? Were you there when I created the stars in the heavens? Can you number them, right? He's like, who are you? In other words, Job, it's not for you to know why you went through this. God knows the future. God knows what we're going to go through. Sometimes we go through the things we go through because of our own choices. Sometimes we go through things because of other people's choices. And sometimes we go through them just because we live on this planet and we go through stuff. But if we are going through it, God has allowed us to go through it, and God has a reason he has allowed us to go through it. I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. And it's unsettling, isn't it? Because there's some things we go through that have you guys ever heard people in the world say, why would God ever allow X, Y, and Z to happen? But the truth is, God knew all along it would happen. Or God knew maybe, and see, then you get into something that we don't completely understand, is how can God know but God not know at the same time, right? And it has to do with free will. God knows what's going to happen, but we still have the choice, and we can still change the mind of God. Anyway, it gets into this real convoluted discussion. But knowing that God knows the future hopefully brings comfort in that whatever we're going through, God has allowed us to go through it for a reason. If nothing else, it's because he hopes that it will glorify him. Sometimes it's because he hopes it'll make us stronger. Sometimes it's because he hopes it will help us come back to him, right? But God knows the future. He knows what it holds. Especially right now, it's unsettling. We have no idea when we're going to be able to go into a store without a mask on. We have no idea whether these vaccines are going to actually work well. We have no idea how many strains of this COVID-19 stuff we're going to have that kind of spreads around. We have no idea about all this stuff, but God knows. And I think that's why God says in the New Testament, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough worry, right? Because God's got a plan. We only have bits and pieces of that plan, but we have enough of it to faithfully follow him. And that's where faith comes in too. So God knows the future, and that brings confidence, it brings boldness, but it also hopefully brings strength in that we have hope. We're not built for this home or for this world. We're built for eternal life with God. So that's the first lesson I see in this, in verse 1-8, is that God knows the future. The second set of verses, 9-12, and we're going to read those in a moment, but I'm going to go ahead and give you what I see lesson-wise in this. Not only does God know the future, but God pays attention to what's going on. God pays attention. Do you guys remember the psalm, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? It's David writing the psalm. And I understand David doesn't actually believe God doesn't see him and God is forgetting him and all that. Really what David's saying is it really feels like you have God. But we don't serve a God who doesn't understand us. We don't serve a God who doesn't pay attention. It's not like the Grecian gods and the Roman gods who kind of do their own thing and play games, and they don't really pay attention to a lot of stuff that humanity's doing because they're so self-absorbed with themselves. God pays attention. He knows what we go through. He knows what we're trying to do. He knows everything. He pays attention. He knows what we do and what we don't do. He knows our thoughts, Scripture says, right? He knows our hearts. God pays attention, and this is important because in the vision here, you're going to see he pays attention to what each of these kingdoms do. Especially, he pays attention to the fourth kingdom, that of Rome. Let's read 9 through 12 here. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and his hair of his head like pure wool. So white as snow, right? He's pure. He's able to judge, right? He stands unable to be condemned. He is wise, we see, with a pure wool on his head. He has age and he's wise. In other words, there's that wisdom that comes with age. It's not some new person that comes to this throne of judgment. But then look, his throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. So this is interesting because we see Ancient of Days as a reference to God, and we see, yes, the snow symbolizes pure judgment and his purity, and he's got wisdom, and he's aged. He's not new to this throne. He's got eternal nature. We see burning fire, and this is often believed to be an indication of his fierce judgment that he is about to dispense. We serve a jealous God. We serve a God who is just. I was watching a evangelist, I can't remember the guy's name, on YouTube earlier this week, and he was talking about this, and he brought out the idea that we serve a God, and we all know this, but I can't remember how he explained it, but he did a great job at explaining we serve a God who is just, and that means he has to take out the penalty on someone or something, right? And we know that was God, that was Christ. But we also serve a just God. That means if we don't follow that just God, there are consequences. And see, the kingdoms don't follow God, and especially Rome, which fights against God, which opposes God in many ways, and persecutes God as time goes. The wheels on a throne, it seems kind of strange. We see this in Ezekiel chapters 1 and 10 as well. And in Ezekiel, this seems to show that it's more of a chariot throne. So this is a God, a warrior God maybe, and a God who is active in justice. And so we see the Ancient of Days, or God, taking this throne with wheels that were burning with fire. In verse 10, a stream of fire, let me get it where I can actually read it. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000s times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. What does this sound like? Leaving out the fiery chariot type stuff. It sounds like Judgment Day, doesn't it? And see, this is not uncommon when talking about judgment. Now, this Judgment Day we see actually takes place, and we're going to see as we go through, hopefully, that Jesus, whenever he ascends to the throne, this depicts Jesus taking his rightful spot whenever we get into Daniel 7 and following. But it also relates to the end of time. But keep in mind here, we're going to, well, let's read and then we'll get to that. I looked then in verse 11, because of the sound of great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So this gets interesting all of a sudden. This gets interesting because what we see going on is this is a judgment day, right? We serve a God who pays attention. We serve a God who pays attention enough that he is able to judge and bring judgment. And as he paid attention, he saw this fourth beast and he saw this fourth empire, if you will. And it was so atrocious to him. It was so horrible that, what does it say happened? It was killed and its body was destroyed and it was given over to fire. Remember what happened in the statue with the coming of the kingdom of God? It shattered, right? That final kingdom shattered, which also shattered the rest of it. Here, the fate of the fourth beast takes place. I'm in agreement with majority of authors, not just Church Christ, but several others as well. But I'm in agreement that I think this is talking about what we see unfold in Revelation. Now, I'm not saying there's a literal 1,000-year reign and all this other stuff, but Revelation, keep in mind what's going on in Revelation is John the Revelator is depicting what Christ had come and done and what that ultimately means for us, right? And so this, I believe, is depicting the overcoming of the Roman Empire, signifying the kingdom of God overcoming all kingdoms of the world. Now, why is it so harsh on the Roman Empire? It's because of the horrible stuff the Roman Empire does to the people of God. Remember, in the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, and even to some extent in the Greek-Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, but especially in the Babylonian and the Medo-Persian Empire, remember, there were times when they were acknowledging of God, weren't there? Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, all of them acknowledged the God of heaven. They may not have served only him, but remember, they were sympathetic to at least some of his people from time to time. Rome did not technically do that for the majority of the time. In fact, they persecuted heavily the people of God. And so as we get into this portion here, we see that there's a God who pays attention, a God who sits on a throne and he watches and he pays attention because this God gives out judgment. That brings us to the next section, which is verses 15 through 28. Oops, sorry, I skipped a section, didn't I? 13. Let's go to verse 13 and 14. In verse 13, after this takes place, their dominion is taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season of time, while the fourth kingdom, as we read, was completely annihilated. Verse 13 and 14, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. We've heard this before, right? What did Jesus refer to himself as? Son of man. Right? One came like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Well, where do we see this take place? This takes place in the ascension of Jesus, right? Jesus goes to the Father. He is given the kingdom. He is returned to the Father in Acts chapter 1. And as we see this, well, actually, let's read Acts chapter 1. I know this is quick. You may not be there right now, but Acts chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. When he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. This is Jesus. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, we're in verse 11 now, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. So this right here, I believe this is talking about when Jesus ascends back into heaven, he's presented again before God, right? And what is said in scripture about Jesus? Jesus becomes the ruler of all. The supreme, the sovereign ruler, right? And so what can we learn from these two verses? Well, we talked about God pays attention. Here we see, not only does God know the future, not only does God pay attention, but God and Jesus, they're sovereign. They're supreme. They are ruler. the ruler. Jesus, right? This is why New Testament talks about God sets up kings and kingdoms, because God has given dominion of the entire nations. He has given it to Christ. Isn't that awesome? We serve a sovereign king. We serve the king that is above anything and anyone. We serve the greatest king within the greatest kingdom this world has ever and will ever know. And so here we see some wonderful scripture that declares Christ taking the kingdom. Now, this certainly can apply to the end of time, right? But it definitely 100% applied to when Christ went into heaven and the kingdom was given to him. So this is why I say in Daniel, especially in these latter parts of Daniel, this is why I said throughout this, there's a little bit of historical, meaning that took place, whether it's in the time of Jesus or other parts of history, but there's also a still yet to come portion of this, where it takes place whenever Christ returns to take us home, right? But this judgment seat that God is sitting on, the God in heaven sits on this judgment seat, and he says, I've been watching, I've been paying attention, and I am going to judge. And Rome didn't measure up. In fact, no kingdom measured up. Again, these are just symbolic of the earthly kingdoms. And the dominion of all peoples was given to Christ. So that by the way, the fact that Jesus is sovereign, he's the supreme ruler, this makes me feel better too, because it doesn't matter how much Satan wants to pretend like he's in control and pretend like he has dominion. He's only got dominion if we tell him he does, right? If we allow him to rule over us. Christ has the final answer. He has the final word. Satan knows it, right? Satan knows it. Remember whenever Jesus would go, and you would see, especially with Legion, right? What do you want from us, Jesus of Nazareth, right? They're terrified of this guy because they know he is supreme. So even in Daniel, even though it gets very kind of murky in some of this, we can pull out lessons that we can proclaim to everybody. We can pull out things that they might be elementary reminders, but they're vital to our lives as Christians and to our Christian walk. God and Jesus are supreme rulers. They're sovereign. And so we see this taking place. And then we get into some more interesting stuff here. Then we get the interpretation. And I'm going to go ahead and give you the lesson we can draw out of the remainder of this chapter here. And that is, God is in control and command. God is in control. Why? Because God's sovereign, because he pays attention and he's the ultimate judge, and because he knows the future. God is in control. Daniel chapter 7, let's look in verse 15. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions in my head alarmed me. In other words, it made me uneasy to see all of this, he says. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all of this. So this is where I said, now, granted, it's interesting and it's great because he wanted to know the truth. He wanted to know what actually all of this meant. But first it was the king seeking out Daniel for interpretation. Now Daniel has to have the interpretation to him. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Verse 17, these four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. See, this is why we're talking about this Most High, right? This is Christ who takes possession forever. Verse 19, then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war. Look what it says. It made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. See, here again, we see like a little bit of here now and then more to come, right? We see this could have specifically taken place within that Roman Empire whenever Christ came and Christ took dominion of everything. But it also, again, what happens at the end of the age, right? It's a very similar scenario, but a huge scale. In verse 22, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the entire earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. Right? And we know the Roman Empire did great things. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall arise. That's where we got most likely the first 10 kings of the kingdom. And another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones and shall put down 3 of the kings. He shall speak words against. Look at what the problem is here. Words against the Most High. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High. In other words, he's going to persecute them. He shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand and for a time, times, and half a time. In other words, there's going to be a while that this is going to go on. And one reason why many believe this is Domitian is because of the horrible things that Domitian does. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Here's the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me. My color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. That's interesting, by the way. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about on this. Now, we've already kind of walked through the persecution and how all this stuff is taking place, and we've only got about 4 minutes by my watch left. So let me kind of share a couple of things. Here we see God saying, yeah, things are going to be really, really bad, but what do we see? At the very end, God is still in control. Whether that's within the Roman Empire, whether that's within the Babylonian Empire, whether that's within whenever the Nazis were taking over the world, whether that's at the end of all time, God is in control. He has it covered. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff in this that helps remind us that even when terrifying things are happening, even when terrifying things are coming down the pipeline, God has control. He is watching over us. He is taking care of things, even when it doesn't seem like it to us, right? Because often we don't see the behind the scenes that is going on. But God is in control. He retains command of everything. But look what happened at the very end of this. At the close of the chapter, there's assurance given to the people of God that God's kingdom will overcome. It will last forever. Stephen Miller wrote this: in spite of one's interpretation of the details of this prophecy, all will agree that the chapter continues the theme of the sovereignty of God, in spite of opposition from Belshazzar or the despicable ruler described in this chapter, God is still and will always be in control. I thought that was really a neat quote there. Look what Daniel does at the end of this. When something alarms us, when something scares us, when we're frightened, when we don't know what the future holds, what do? So we talked about 4 things that God does, but I think Daniel gives us an example of something we can do, which kind of goes hand in hand with some of the classes we've had in the adult class the last couple of weeks as well. Look what Daniel does again. The end of the matter, as for me, Daniel, my thoughts alarmed me. My color changed. It's kind of like he became white as a ghost, right? But look what he says. I kept the matter in my heart. What does that mean? Well, that means he thought about it. He mulled it over. He didn't go alarm everybody else, did he? He kept it and just kind of thought through it and thought on it. When things are going awry, when things look crazy, when we don't understand what's going on, when we're so confused, which I pretty much live my life confused anyway, but when we're just confused with everything going on, don't be alarmists, right? Think about it, process it, seek for God's guidance, but don't go freak everybody out either. I think there's a time and a place for us to share alarm, but that often comes after we've processed the alarm that we're experiencing and thought through it from a biblical standpoint and from a lens in which God might look through it. I kept the matter in my heart. It doesn't mean Daniel never said anything to anybody else, but he thought about it. And I think as Christians, we need to remember the first 4 things we talked about. God knows the future. God pays attention, watches, and judges. God is sovereign and God is in control. We need to remember those 4 things. And as things seem to be falling apart, and as we remember those 4 things, those allow us, even when we're terrified, even when we don't know what's going to happen, it allows us to, as Scripture says, be still and know that I am God. It allows us to process rather than running around alarming everyone, right? I mean, think about it. And regardless of what candidate you vote for in any of the elections, what happens every single time we have a presidential change? One side or the other runs around like the streets are on fire and the whole world's going to melt away, right? Has that happened yet? Could it happen? Sure, absolutely. But guess what? Worst case scenario, it happens, but you know what? God is in control. God is paying attention. God knows the future, and God is all powerful. In other words, he's sovereign. So we need to voice concerns. We need to warn others, but we need to do it with a calmness in our spirit. I kept the matter in my heart. Think about it, mull over it. Don't do a knee-jerk reaction. And that's not exactly what he's getting at, but I think that's a good lesson for us in this, because Daniel wasn't living through this at the moment. He was seeing the vision. Sometimes when we're living in the midst of it, it gets a lot harder to kind of just be still, right? So let me go over my points again. God knows the future. God pays attention. God is sovereign. God is in control. Those are the first 4. And then because of those 4 things, the way we can respond is, and I think a better way to say it than what I said earlier is the verse, be still and know that he is God, right? Have a calm in our spirit. Let's go to God in prayer, and then we'll dismiss class. Thanks, guys. I know this was a rough chapter to get through, but it's fun, hopefully, still.